All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the cloud computing lecture at Oakland University. So we're going to continue our discussion on storages that is offered, different types of storages that is offered by the AWS platform. So the last class, we had started the discussion mostly about the elastic block store, which is basically access of storage over the network, and that can be attached to any particular EC2 instances. The only notable thing, or not the only notable thing, but one of the most notable things that you have to keep in mind, that these elastic block stores, the volumes that you create, whether you create it independently of your instance launch or whether you create it with your instance launch, is basically co-located to a particular subnet, right? So that means if you create a volume here, and that needs to be deployed to a particular subnet, which will be present within your VPC, those volumes, essentially, as a result of the architecture itself, cannot be accessed across multiple subnets. Okay, and subnets is another way of saying availability zone, assuming that your VPC architecture has a subnet deployed to every availability zone if we are following the default architectural style for our VPCs, right? So the only way where you can probably take a given data volume of elastic block store, which has been deployed to a given subnet, and then move it to another subnet such that another EC2 instance can access it later on, is through the creation of what we learned as snapshots, which basically makes a copy of your volume, okay, of your storage volume. And snapshots are also capable of taking the snapshot, so to speak, of your entire VM as well, your virtual machines, or basically your entire EC2 instances. So if you want to kind of preserve the state of your EC2 instances that is kind of deployed in one region, or if you just want to, not region, sorry, in one availability zone, or if you just want to take a backup of your instance, then that is also something that can be done with the use of snapshots itself. And then finally, snapshots also has a very important role to play with respect to creating your own custom Amazon machine images. So that means if you have, let's say, launched an EC2 instance, and then each EC2 instance will have some sort of primary volume that will be associated to it, right, on which the guest operating system's distribution can be launched, right? So if that is the case, if you're in a situation like this, and on top of that, you add your own software stack, which is relevant to the functionalities that you are trying to execute, right? So in that situation, if you want to store that entirety of that software stack along with the operating system distribution as a particular custom machine image for your own organization, and you want to make that available to others, if you think that that is something useful that you have created, then what you do is you take the snapshot of your operating system drive, right? So when you take the operating system drive, you make a snapshot of it, and then you can right click on that snapshot and you can create a machine image out of that, and you can register that with the Amazon Machine Image Catalog Marketplace, or AMI Marketplace, wherein Amazon will check it, and then if everything looks good, there is no malicious content, then it will basically make it available in the list of AMIs that has been submitted by third parties, right? Non-trusted third parties, so to speak, or like everyday users, right? But the only thing that you have to keep in mind is in terms of cost. If you register an AMI with the AMI catalog, then that will cost you money, right? So if you do not want to pay for that, then make sure that you either deregister it after you have, demoed it to understand how it works, or if you don't need it, then don't register it altogether, right? You can keep it somewhere. Well, you cannot keep it somewhere else, but essentially that's the only way you can work with it. So only do it if you think that it is necessary to kind of keep a custom machine image, rather than doing all the work of adding the software stack when you're working with other EC2 instances, right? So moving on, we're going to talk about the other two storage options that comes on the AWS platform. Notably, the first one is called, the second one is called EFS, and the third one is known as the simple storage service, or S3. Okay. So you have to keep in mind that these are two different technologies that is available for us compared to the Elastic Block Store. And the first few exercises that we are going to be doing is to kind of understand the basic functionalities of these two services. Okay, so in order to work with EFS, or the Elastic File Storage, the first two things that we want to do is basically launch two EC2 instances and then kind of give it some time to initialize and stuff like that. So the first few things that I want you to do is go to your instances, okay? And then in the instance, I want you to launch two EC2 instances. You should use the Amazon machine image for Linux, okay? And then what you can do is probably launch one instance in, let's say, subnet 2A for the Ohio region. And then let's launch the second instance in subnet 2B and then move forward from there, right? So again, two instances to be launched, one in one particular subnet, and then the second instance in another subnet using the Linux AMI, all right? So let's go ahead and let's do that. So I'll just give a name here called test EFS 2A to kind of signify that I'm going to be sending this to subnet 2A. Here, I want to select the Linux AMI, okay? So I will select this Linux 2023 AMI. Make sure that we are using the T2 micro instance, the key pair login. I'm going to use mine. You guys can use yours. We are going to select an existing security group. And I already have my working security group that I'm using for most of my exercise, which is this one. So I'm just going to select that, leave the rest default, nothing to do here. Okay. And then I actually have a preference on the subnet here. So I'm just going to edit the network settings. And then here, I'm just going to select subnet 2A. So here it is, US East 2A. So I'm going to select that US East 2A, leave the rest default. Okay, and then just hit launch instance. And it will take care of the process. We will go back to the instance area, and then I will launch another instance. And I will call it probably test EFS 2B. I want to launch this to the 2B subnet. Okay. And then browse for more EMIs, have the Linux AMI. I'll select that, ensure T2 micro, key pair login, the same process, select that, edit the network settings, subnet, I want to select 2B here. So I'm going to select US East 2B, security group, existing, and I select the existing security group that I have, leave the rest as default, nothing to do, and then launch the instances. So after these two steps, essentially, we will have two instances that is going to be initialized, one deployed to subnet 2A and the other deployed to subnet 2B. Okay, so while we wait for this, for these two things to finish its initialization, let us go to security groups first. So here under network and security, I'm going to go to security groups. And then I'm going to select the security group that I just attached to my subnets here. So I'm just going to select that. Okay. And then I'm going to edit the inbound rules because I need to add another communication protocol that will allow these instances to basically communicate with the Elastic file storage, right? So I'm going to edit this. I'm going to add a new rule. So we already have one for SSH. We have one for remote desktop protocol, HTTPS and HTTP. So I'm going to add a rule, drop down the option list, and I'm going to look for NFS. Okay. So the network file system or support communication, right? So we're going to use the NFS and which is running on the TCP port for 2049. And then here you can select from anywhere, okay? Or you also have the option to kind of allow the communication to happen within the security group itself. That is all the instances or all the resources that belong to the same security group, however you want to kind of set this up. So this description will basically be to allow communication with EFS, okay, service. All right, so everything looks good. We don't have to do anything else. And then we will just save the rule. All right, and then now we have added this new protocol. So remember, if you do not add this protocol, essentially, you will not be able to work with your Elastic file system, right? So you won't be able to do that. So once that is done, I think we can go back to the instances, check what is happening here. Both are still initializing. So as they initialize, what I'm going to do is basically search for EFS, which is my Elastic File Services. Okay, so this will take us to this system here. And if you're visiting this for the first time, you can see this page with all the other widgets. It gives some walkthrough as to how you want to use it, lists all the advantages, different related services that you can use. And it also has a helpful widget here with respect to how much it will cost with respect to the utilization of the EFS service, right? So it's not much. It's like 30 cents per gigabytes of file that you're using. Kind of in a way, like if you keep on increasing the storage that you need, at certain point of time, the cost kind of goes and hits a upper ceiling limit. And after that, it kind of plateaus out from that point of time, and it doesn't require too much, right? But if you have like something that is customized for high throughput, then that is going to cost you a good amount of money in that situation, right? But here the decision making is more along the lines of like, what type of storage do you need, right? Because if you're dealing with organized structure of data, and there is a lot of IOPS that is going on, which does not need to be executed in memory, then you're probably better off using the database architecture rather than kind of bringing in a block store or basically a file system, depending on your needs, right? So essentially, for your IT architecture, for your IT infrastructure, you kind of have to first understand like what type of data you're dealing with, right? There are two things that goes hand in hand. One is, what type of processing do you want to execute, which determines like how much of it needs to be executed in memory, and stuff like that, and how resource hungry are your processes going to be. And the other is basically your data. It's like, what type of data are you going to deal with? How frequent is the input output going to be like, or what is the read and write situation? How many reads over a given unit time? How many writes over a given unit time? So these are some of the things that you have to first decide as an architect before you choose one of your storage systems, and then kind of check their pricing calculator or their pricing models in order to work with it. Anyways, so go ahead and click on Create File System. And then it will ask you to provide a name. So I can give a name here, the test Elastic File System with EC2, something like this, okay? And then you need to specify in which VPC deployment this file system is going to be deployed into, okay? So essentially, how this is connected in comparison to your Elastic Block Store is that we notice that when the block store is kind of initialized and deployed, that belongs to a particular subnet itself or a particular availability zone, right? Elastic File System, in contrast, is deployed or associated to your VPC. So that means, given the amount of different availability zones your VPC is deployed across, the Elastic File System will be available across all those different subnets. So what I'm trying to say here is that, let's say you create a VPC and it only spans across a single subnet, right? So that means if you create an Elastic File System, then that system in that particular VPC will only be available for a particular subnet, okay? Whereas if you take the example of our default VPC that we are working with, okay, our VPC spans across 3 different availability zones, or essentially saying that all the availability zones that are present within the availability region itself. So as a result of this scenario, this architectural scenario, if we now select the only VPC that is available in this region, then this EFS is basically available across all the different subnets. So please keep this in mind. Unlike S3 service, which is by default available across the entire region, EFS is not available across the entire region. An EFS is associated with the VPC, and depending on the architecture of the VPC that you have developed, that is how many availability zones are involved, that many subnets will have the access to the EFS. In addition to that, you can also establish separately from outside of Amazon's network architecture, you can establish VPN, virtual private network, okay? And then directly mount those file systems to your local computers if you would like to do that as well, right? So there is also an option there. And then there is option that you can replicate your data as well. So that means you get the option to kind of move your data across all the different VPCs, or you can keep the backup itself within the given VPC, right? So those are the two different options that you have. You have standard, you have one zone, right? So we're going to choose the one where we kind of ensure the fact that the redundancy of the data is available across all the multiple availability zones that are there. Because, I mean, you can select this, there's nothing wrong with this, but if you think in terms of structural, in terms of fault tolerance, it's always better to kind of span it across multiple zones if it is available, right? So you get all of these options, and then you can just hit create at this point of time, right? So we're going to give it some time and let it finish the creating process here. And there we go, it is available. So the next thing that we want to do is just click on that VPC, and then it will just show you that it has some standard file there inside of that. But most of the other stuff is kind of available, okay? So what we need to do now is, once we get into this particular EFS that we have created, and it's kind of working on the backup and stuff like that, we need to go to the network tab, essentially. So now you can see here that for each of the subnets that we have one for 2A, we have one for 2B, and we have one for 2C, right? Because we have 3 availability zones. There will be a mount target ID for each of the subnets. So that means depending on where your EC2 instance has been launched, you have to use the correct mount target ID in order to kind of mount this file system to the EC2 instances, right? So that means you don't get a universal mount ID for all your EC2 instances across all the subnets. You get a unique mount ID for each of the subnets where the EFS has been launched, right? So when we do connect, you have to pay attention to this mount target ID, which differs from subnet to subnet, as well as the IP address of this particular EFS, which is a little bit different, right? So from each subnet that you have come across. So these are the things that you kind of have to keep in mind while you are working with all of these different types of services which are deployed across different regions, right? Sometimes you don't get this universal points in these situations, okay? So we will keep this as is. So what I want to do is basically middle click on this Amazon console home button, okay? And then that will open a new tab here. And basically I want to go back to my EC2. It should be running 2 instances. So I will go there, and essentially everything looks good here. And what I want you all to do is to basically SSH into these 2 instances, okay? So that means individually, I'm going to create 2 SSH terminals, and I'm going to just log into these instances using my key value pair, okay? So please keep that in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So you guys can do the same thing as well on your side. So basically, let's try the CMD option this time for a change. Okay, so I'm going to move this here, and I'm going to do my SSH connection. Let's do it for subnet 2A first. Okay, so connect. Go to SSH client. Okay, and then basically run this command. This is for me. You will have a different command if you're working on this. So for my command terminal window, I need to essentially navigate to the area where I have my SSH key. So that should be probably here. Okay, and then copy this person and then paste it. Yes. Okay, so I've connected to my first EC2 instance here. This is basically the 2A EC2 instances, and I'm going to do the same thing for 2B now. So I'm going to click on 2B, connect, go to SSH, and then I need to launch another command prompt. I need to run that as an administrator. So let me go ahead and do the same set of things. Okay, and then copy the connection here, paste it, run this, it will ask me for this. Okay, all right, so I have two different instances that are running and they are ready to go. So the next thing that we want to essentially do is make sure that our security groups have been selected. So we have already modified the security groups for our inbound routes. The only thing that we need to do is essentially associate those security groups to the EFS service that we have essentially created. Okay, so what we can do here is, oh, this is just going to show you this. So we're going to find the security group itself. So let's say we go to manage. Okay, and have we not selected this? Is it still creating? Automatic backups are enabled. So what I'm trying to do right now is basically find the area. Okay, so it is using the default security group, and this is where I'm going to change it. Okay, so the way we are going to do it is go to the network tab, and then in the network tab on the top right hand side, you can see here that there is a button for manage. And if once you click the manage, you can see here that there is a default security group that is associated with this, right? We don't want the default security group. We essentially want the security group which is associated to our EC2 instances. Okay, so essentially that will allow the communication to take place. And it will also allow the network traffic to kind of go through it. So I'm going to replace this default and replace it with the one that we just edited a few moments ago, which is, for me, it is the demo SG Ohio. So go ahead and do the same thing on your side. You can delete the default, you can keep the default. There is no problem in having a given resource belong to multiple security groups. You can very well do that. So there is nothing wrong with keeping multiple security groups. I'm just keeping my canvas kind of clean so that, you know, I don't get blindsided by some move that I'm not aware of, right? So everything is set. Then we save it. Okay, so now the security groups are also associated to our file systems as well. So the next step that we essentially have to do is connect to this file system. So now if you notice at the very top of this particular portal, there is an option which says attach, right? So we're going to go ahead and click on that attach. Okay, and we get two different options. Okay, we can either do mount via DNS, okay, which is the mount target ID that we were looking at, or we can mount via IP address, which is the public IP address that we were looking into when we were talking about those two different features, right? If you can see very bleakly in this grayed out area here, this is the IP addresses that we were talking about. And then this is the DNS addresses or the mount target ID that we are going to be using, right? So for this exercise, I'm going to just move forward with the DNS because DNS essentially at the end of the day maps to an IP address, right? So we're going to do that, right? Mount via DNS. And essentially, once you do that, we have to run these two commands, right? So these two things here that will be used. So what I'm going to do on my side is probably open a notepad, since I don't want to revisit this again. I will copy this, paste this here, okay, and then make a note here that this is with the mount helper. All right, EFS mount helper. And then I'm going to copy the next one, which is the NFS client. And I'm going to keep that ready for my usage if I need that. So NFS client. All right, so it depends on what we install in our EC2 instances that we're using this guy, then we use this. If you use an NFS client, then we need to use this, right? So essentially, it's depending on the type of software that you're using to mount your file system. You are essentially going to be using that specific situation, okay? So, all right, so we can close this now, close this window, but we kind of might have to revisit this and check the target ID when we are connecting from a particular EC2 instances that is in a particular location, okay? So what we need to do is go back to our EC2 page, okay, and find the window which is for our IP addresses. All right, so I think this is the first one, and this is running in instance 2A. Okay, so yeah, so that is 3.144. So that is 3.144. So this is running in 2A. So this is the public subnet 2A. So the first thing that I want to do is clear out this whole window, and then I need to install the resources that will allow me to kind of use the mount helper, right? So we saw that there are two options that are available if we are connecting using DNS. One is the mount helper, and then one is the NFS client. So we have one or the other options when we are working or trying to connect it from the instance. So I need to install some softwares that will allow me to utilize these utilities that will enable us to connect with the EFS instance, right? So go ahead and type these commands. These commands are also available on lecture 8, slide 21, okay? So if you don't want to copy it from my screen, you can refer to that lecture 8, slide 21, step 4, subpoint 4, to kind of get your things running. Yes.
Do you have copy paste ability in for this?
Yeah, so you can copy, and you can, at least for command prompt, you can right click.
Okay.
Is that what you're asking?
I was wondering why you're typing when you could just copy paste. It's more accurate.
Oh, the encoding for Microsoft PowerPoint is not something that I trust fully. So if it puts some hidden characters and stuff like that I cannot essentially see, then I will have to break my head, and it has happened in the past, so I'm not taking a chance with that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just my fear factor. Every programmer has one. Okay. So like one example I can give you, what happens is that this -y that we use for the yes, sometimes in PowerPoint, to get that full hyphen, it actually does this, right? So I don't like those behaviors in the encoding, kind of messes things up. So anyways, so I'm just going to install the Amazon utility for EFS. If it works for you guys, that is absolutely fine, right? You don't have to have my, what is it called? I forget the word for it. My superstition, I guess, so to speak. If it works for you, just please go ahead and copy paste it, okay? So essentially, I'm, as an administrator, running the yum utility. It's similar to apt-get utility, right? And what I'm saying is, I'm giving a yes command already to install this Amazon EFS utilities, okay, which basically is given by this particular name itself, right? So I'm gonna hit yes, and it will do its magic, right? And then what you want to do is kind of create a different directory or a point where you would want to mount the file system that you have created, right? So we have to create that directory essentially in our instance, and then that will be an open mount point or an exposed mount point where we will attach that file system to. Okay. Otherwise, if you just run the attach here, then it will be attached to the root directory itself within your distribution, right? So that is not something, it's not wrong, but it's just going to look weird, okay, if an external mount system is just connected to your root directory itself. So the first thing, the second thing that I will do is basically create a directory which will become the exposure point or the exposed point where I will, kind of connect that, right? So what I'm going to say is like MNT and then EFS, okay, because that is what it will be working on. So run that, and that will create that EFS. And now we are going to go back and check what we have here. Okay, so here we have the sudo mount, and then for EFS, we need to run this, and the output is going to be using the TLS protocol for the communication. And the file system, this is the ID. So you will have your own ID, by the way. If you type this ID, or if you type the command that is given in the slides, that will throw an error, because this portion here itself is basically where you have the actual DNS that you're pinging and you're connecting. And this needs to be the directory that you have created, or the exposed point that we just talked about in our instance, to which it will latch on, right? So remember, we have gone a step forward to create this directory. Okay, so if you notice here, the name of the directory that I created was, I have a directory called mount, MNT, and within that mount directory, I have a subdirectory which kind of identifies that I'm attaching it to EFS itself, right? So instead of writing EFS here, what you need to write is basically the same thing that you did in the command prompt. If you're following my instructions, you basically have to create this parent directory and then the subdirectory itself, right? So then it will latch onto this EFS. So we just took an extra step in terms of the organization. So listening to the words of encouragement, I'm going to copy this command and then paste it for this person here. Okay, and hope everything kind of goes well. Okay. All right, so everything kind of has gone smoothly at this point, and this has allowed you to attach an external file system to your EC2 instances, right? So this enables you to kind of connect any kind of file system. And now I can leave the other half of the exercise, which is to do the same thing, but from a different EC2 instance. It's the same process. There's nothing too complicated about it. This is just to make you aware of the fact that, remember, EFS, the takeaway, if you think about it, is EFS is associated to a VPC. So that means, depending on the number of subnets that will be present in your VPC architecture, DNS or an IP will be associated to each of those subnets. And then the EFS will be available towards the entirety or in the entirety of that subnet. EFS also gives you the opportunity, if you are ever VPNing into your AWS platform, then you can use your local computer and you can mount those file systems to your local computer as well. Quite similar to how you can do the same thing with your OU drives. You can connect it, if you VPN into it, you can connect that drive to your particular local computer that you are using to VPN, right? And now if you kind of CD into this particular directory, you, instead of anything that you save will be saved directly to your EFS file system, right? And it has already a backup that is enabled, that is data redundancy is already running for it, right? So if we go back and check this in our EFS terminal, we can see that automatic backups are already enabled for this. So that means if I, at this point of time, I don't need this, so let me just quit out of this real quick. Okay, I'll just close this. Okay, so essentially what happens is, now if I CD into this mount EFS directory, I am basically working with my EFS, right? So if I save any file here, eventually it will create automatic backups of it, so we don't have to worry about losing your data either, right? So that is something that is interesting that Amazon provides you by itself, right? So you can do those things, and it will keep a backup by itself, and Amazon will take care of those fault tolerance aspects that is associated with respect to your data storage. Okay. So any particular questions in this exercise? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a GUI way to do this at all? Or
Not that I am aware of.
all right. And does SCP or something like that work to get files off or on to the?
You can.
Okay.
Yeah. So it works like any other file system, right? So if you have connection to it, but since it's an external connection, you need to have some sort of VPN to establish your presence within the AWS platform. Okay.
Professor,
Yeah.
is there any way I can just copy this instance and replicate it on, let's say I have a UAT and I want to replicate it on my production. So
You're
can
talking
I?
about instance, or are you talking about file system?
I am talking about a complete system, like a group.
You mean the entire VPC itself?
Maybe like I've just created, I want to create a system like, see, I can miss a configuration somewhere while replicating it in production. So if I have successfully created an infra on UAT and then I want to push that on production without any mistakes. So is there any way I can copy some configurations and push it on?
So I'm missing a little bit on your question here. So what exactly are you trying to copy and push?
The entire configuration, like
Of what? So each
of
resource has
infra.
its own configuration, right? So which configuration are you talking about?
Maybe any programmatical way of doing all these things.
So for just the EC2 instance, there is something that we call as IAC, which stands for infrastructure as code. So you can write essentially everything that we just did as a script, and that will automate the process of execution of your entire configuration.
Okay, got you.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that way, instead of using these portals or these browser interfaces, what you do is basically you write your entire deployment, your architecture as a code, and then you just come to that portal just one time and then execute your code. And then AWS will take care of all the deployments. So generally, as you advance from a beginner stage to more intermediate and towards advanced cloud architect, you will not be using the portals at those point of time. You will be using infrastructure as code. I think we do have one exercise where we introduce how this works. So
okay, yeah.
But keep this in mind. What you are looking for is this guy here.
Right. Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So if everything is done with this particular exercise, we don't have to do anything else. So the only thing is you close this and then start terminating everything else. So that means you need to terminate all of this. And you can see here, since it has been running for a while now, we can get some results here in terms of monitoring as well. This is something that we didn't have a chance to see before. But we can see that how many packets have been sent out of the network, how many packets have been received. Okay, so this kind of gives you an idea of what is happening when you're connecting an instance and then sending file data. So if we kept on working with that particular EC2 instances, then it would have shown here. So this is basically the connection that was happening for the first instance. And since we didn't connect with the second instance, this is basically just the transmission of our PEM authentication and stuff like that that was happening, right? So essentially some good pieces of information. So here you can see this is the point where it kind of installed the utilities. So we ran a process there, and then we did the connection that went into the network byte. So some additional information, just if you're interested to kind of take a look at it, then you can see it. So anyways, so what we want to do is basically terminate these two instances. So make sure you terminate them. Okay, then go to Amazon file systems. Okay, and then you want to delete this instance. All right. So it will ask you to enter the ID of your file system. So here I can copy paste with conviction. Okay. So then it will come out of that file system. I think it is deleting the mount targets for the file system, but essentially, as I keep on repeating myself, even after you terminate, don't just assume that it will terminate. See it for yourself that it has actually terminated. Okay, sometimes it might be stuck with some process that was running, so it's not able to complete, and it just freezes at that point of time, and then it just chucks that process, right? So just make sure that it actually goes away. And same goes for EC2 as well. Okay, so that it should not be there. It should stay terminated essentially. All right. So next, we can move on to our last storage option that is available with EC2. I don't know why they keep giving this thing all the time. So the last one, we are going to be moving on to S3, okay, or the simple storage service. Now, the beauty of S3, so we can close this window as well. Everything is deleted here. Yeah, success deleted. Okay. So the beauty of S3, as we have pointed out before, is that an S3 bucket is available across an entire region. Okay. So essentially, you can see here, the moment I switch on to S3, things have changed here, right? So the region essentially just by itself moved on to global when it comes to it. So that's how you can access S3, is that it can be pinged from anywhere within that particular region, right? So there are various uses of S3 for any type of backup that you have on AWS itself. That is when AWS creates its internal backups and stuff like that. Depending on the fact that, let's say, if you create a snapshot for backing up your volumes, or you back up your entire VM, that is stored inside an S3 bucket, right? Any kind of media files that you want to save, you can save that in S3, images, videos, whatever it is that you want to save. File storage can be done in S3 itself, right? Any data type that you can think of, you can essentially store that as an object inside the S3 bucket, right? S3 also gives you other benefits. So for example, since you're just storing different objects, what you can store is you can essentially bring in your entire static website that we did for our, I think we did it in one of the EC2 exercises where we transformed the EC2 instance into a web server, and for a static web server, at least to begin with. So you can do the same thing, but instead of running an EC2 instance and converting that into a server, what you can do is you can drop your static website on S3 itself, right? So if you do that and you change the access permission for your objects within your S3 bucket to be public, essentially what can happen is that you can transform a S3 into a static website hosting service, right? So keep that in mind. So those are some of the niche uses of S3, right? If you also have you also have the option for access keys on your S3 itself. So that means if you want to programmatically, as like an API connection, want to integrate the storage of your S3 bucket to some program that you're writing, you can also do that by using the access keys, okay? And just like, Google Drive or OneDrive or any of these other online storage services, you have the option of version controlling and permission control within your S3 as well, okay? The only difference is that, not the difference, but one thing that you have to keep in mind, if you're trying to access the S3 bucket from let's say a subnet that is private, then you have to take additional steps for that routing mechanism, because this S3 is outside the network architecture of your VPC, right? It is not present in a particular VPC. It is not associated to a particular VPC as you have in EFS. So what happens in such a situation is that since it is outside the VPC, in order to communicate with that, essentially all the traffic needs to go through the gateway, right, of your VPC that is present, right? So we know for a fact that each VPC has its own gateway. Now, the problem here is that if you have a private subnet that is present within your VPC architecture, then as we have already discussed this, your private subnets cannot communicate through the internet gateway. So you will have two options here if you ever face such a situation that you have to communicate to an S3 bucket from a EC2 instance or any other service that is present within a private subnet, well, the most immediate option that you have is, it's kind of like a, not the best option, but it does work, is that you have to reroute the traffic of the private subnet to a public instance in a public subnet, and then you have to again proxy that through the gateway router into your S3 bucket. So that requires a proxy connection, right? And if you are looking for a direct connection, then the solution to that is basically to set up what we call as an endpoint. So for the private instances that is present, we have to set up specific endpoints here. So if you notice in your EC2 service, if you go to your EC2 dashboard, you can see that there should be somewhere, it should give us, or it should tell us about endpoints, not EC2, sorry. It should give us in VPC itself. Okay, so you see here that we have the options for setting up an endpoint. So what you need to do is you need to go to these endpoints and then you need to create an endpoint to an AWS service, and then you need to select the services that is available, right? So from there, you can see here that there is an service for S3 for the global access point for the S3 itself, right? And you get the option of many other options here. They should allow us to extend this page here so I can do a single scroll instead of going through. All right. So essentially, that is the second architectural option to set up communication from a private subnet to your AWS services, right? Which is available over the public internet. So that means you need gateway access to set it up, right? You can also create your own custom services if it is running outside AWS. So these are basically the solutions that is used for other endpoint services typically for hybrid deployment and stuff like that. But what you should make a note of and keep in mind is that from a private subnet, if you directly want to communicate with a service, could be from Amazon or could be from somebody else that basically lies outside the VPC, then you can either choose to set up a proxy connection through the public subnet and reroute your traffic of your private subnet through that, and bidirectionally speaking, or you can set up an endpoint which will allow you to directly communicate. It will establish a direct communication channel from your private instances to the services, okay? And you don't have to do the proxy. So just keep this thing in mind while we're working. Okay, so coming back to this, we are going to kind of work now and go through the different options or the different features and aspects that are available in the S3 bucket. We have already seen some of it in action before when we were doing some of the demo exercises in EC2 instances. So we are going to kind of extend that discussion and work on these different features, right? But overall, working with S3 in itself is pretty straightforward, right? Except, I wouldn't say except, but it depends on, like, if you understand how permission policies work, then more or less it is kind of easy, right? So go ahead, create a bucket, and we will say test S3 service. Okay, and then since we are in the global region, it defaulted to the global region. In the creation of your S3 bucket, okay, it will ask you to which region do you want to deploy this bucket to, because remember, the availability of the bucket is region by region. So if you move to another region, you probably will have the availability of another bucket. Another thing to note is, at least on your free tier account or your beginner account, you get to create up to 100 buckets, okay? And if you need more than that, then you have to request Amazon for an increase in quota. And then depending on, they generally give it to you. They will increase the quota of how many buckets can use. And for every bucket, there is no restriction as to how many number of objects you can store. You get charged by how much data you store within the bucket itself. I think for the free tier, it's up to 30 gigabytes. But there is no restriction that you cannot store more than that, right? If you are a paying customer, you can very well continue to store as much as you want in a given bucket, right? So that is up to you for you to decide what you want to do. Okay, so we will keep US East for Ohio. That is good. Access control, we can keep it disabled. Now, remember in one of the exercises, I do recall, we had removed this access, right? We have unchecked this box. So this is the most unsafe option because this essentially allows anybody from the public domain to be able to ping your contents that is present in your bucket, right? So that's like setting a Google Drive permission file to open to all, right? I'm setting it to public, not even through link access, but essentially it's just public. As long as the DNS is given, as long as the URL is available, you can work with it, right? So for now, we will leave this checked, okay? Because this time we are going to visit the permissions tab and we are going to check the permissions independently rather than opening all access like we did the last time. So we are just going to leave it as such, okay? Now there is also an option here which allows you to kind of create the versioning and stuff like that. So this is another option that you can enable. And if you enable it, then if you delete something, if you modify something, then S3 bucket will keep a track or keep a log of what is happening with your buckets itself, right? So that is what you can do. So what we are going to do is we are going to enable versioning because we want to see it in action, that it is able to keep a track of what is happening and what is not happening, okay? Encryption, it's up to you. If you want to disable your encryption, or you can choose one of the two options that is given with respect to how you want to encrypt the devices. So for now, I'm just going to leave it in default option, that whatever option is being set. And then there are also some options with respect to preventing overwriting of the different objects that you're going to be storing inside your S3 bucket and stuff like that. So you can play around with it and you can check what are the outcomes of these options, right? But this is not the scope of our exercise per se. We are not going to look into locking the writing of the objects. So essentially what we have to pay attention to is, of course, the bucket name, because the bucket name will become the URL of the bucket eventually. So you need to remember this, whatever name you provide. Remember the region where you're deploying it, because outside that region, you're not going to be accessing it, okay? And the permission policies, that is the access control list here. So if you want to enable or disable, sorry, that's the word. If you want to disable the public access, then you do get some sub options here. But for now, we are just going to keep the entirety of it blocked. But for your reference, for your points, remember that you have some sub options here and you can read through those sub options. It's kind of self-explanatory as to what is the level of access control that is given to your bucket, depending on what boxes you keep it checked and what boxes are you going to remove. And if you want to draw a correlation, again, this is very similar to your sharing policies in Google Drive. I don't use OneDrive. I've stopped using Dropbox, so I don't remember those things. So in Google Drive, you can right click, you can share it with anyone who belongs to, let's say, the Oakland domain. You can set that up. Or you can set up in a way so that anybody who has the link publicly can view this, or you can make it completely public, right? There's no restriction. So those are basically the different ways of expressing those access control level with these different options that are given here, right? But you can always access these options again once the bucket has been created. So go ahead, create the bucket, and this bucket name already exists. Oh, so it has to be a globally unique name. How about I put my last name here and see if it writes it. So people actually give the same name here. That's interesting. That should be unique, right? Okay. All right, so bucket has been created. Now we can go ahead and then work with the bucket, right? So when you want to work with the bucket, essentially you just need to select the bucket. And then we have already done this before. You can either drag and drop different files and stuff like that here, or you can click on this upload and then essentially you can upload some file in order to work with it, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload some txt file. So you can upload some txt file because it will be really difficult to kind of edit what you call an image or a media file. So I think I'm going to go ahead and find essentially my txt file. So it should be in this particular drive here. So I need to okay, so I'm just going to upload this person here. So this is basically a text file that I'm working with. And then we can edit this text file and stuff like that in order to modify it. And then through version control, we will be able to see the changes that Amazon is tracking with respect to stuff like that. So here, if you kind of maximize all of the stuff here, I can, if you want to have it in an organized way, this is kind of like, silly to explain, but keep in mind that you can create folders and subfolders just like Google Drive. Okay, so there are a few options that you have here that you have to pay attention to. Of course, uploading the file itself is not the biggest complex tasks. This is the URL that you have to keep in mind. So please keep a way to kind of save this URL, because if you are going to access these buckets through a programmatic access, like an API access, you're writing some kind of full stack environment and you want your backend to connect to your S3 to kind of dump data there or read data from there. Or if you have users uploading data and you want a temporary haven before you can sort that data out, check out what has been submitted and stuff like that, then typically this is also I wouldn't say go-to option, but this is an available option for you guys if you want to integrate S3 into your programming environment. So that is also something that you can do. So in all of those situations, essentially the way you have to access your S3 is through your bucket URL, okay, which is in the S3 domain, followed by the name of the bucket that you have given. There will be additional details with respect to the buckets that you're working with, and that kind of inherits the properties that we saw on the previous page with respect to versioning being enabled. So it will track the changes that is happening to this. So in a way, if you read between the lines, if you delete something with versioning being enabled, it's not fully deleted. So it's like it will send it to a recycle bin. So the portal will show that the file is not there, but the tracker, which is keeping a track of your versioning, will keep a copy of that deleted file. So be aware of this fact that when versioning is running, if you delete it, it doesn't get perma deleted in the first click, right? You have to take some additional steps in order to make sure that you fully delete that file. So be aware of this. So it might seem that from your portal that your file is gone, but it's essentially still there in a pseudo recycle bin kind. Encryption and object lock, you can get this information, right? So one of the important things that again, from an architectural point of view, you have to keep in mind is what type of storage class are you using with respect to this bucket. So there are many different options that we have. The free tier essentially offers us with standard. So we are not going to be using any of the other options. But essentially what is happening here is how many availability zones these objects will be accessed or will be made available to how many different availability zones, because the minimum I think is 3, but I might be wrong in that regards with respect to the global infrastructure or AWS. But the standard is 3 availability zones. And then the more popular availability regions have around 6 or more than 3 availability zones, right? So the maximum I've seen is Virginia, which is the HQ to begin with. So you have 6 AZs there, right? But in other situations, you have around 3 to 6-ish and stuff like that. There are more like customized storage options. So for example, there's this one, which is kind of popular and a little bit well-known, which is known as the Glacier one. So essentially they have a unique way of naming their services. I kind of like this from time to time, is that if you have, let's say, for example, here, if you have a archival data, that is you're creating or you're keeping a copy of logs log files and stuff like that for archival purposes over the years. You can use this bucket and you can use this storage instance and stuff like that, right? So essentially, if you know that you are not going to be using that data too often, that you're not going to be reading that data, but when you do read it, you want an instant retrieval, then essentially you need to opt for this Glacier Instant Retrieval class, right? So you can go through this and you can check that there are only a limited number of options there are, and each of them has a set of attributes. So when you are deciding what S3 bucket are you going to be using, you will have to spend some time understanding the different options that you have here and how much it is going to cost. Okay. And I think you don't, except for the second one, all the remaining one is based on how many gigabytes of data that you use in terms of retrieval, right? So again, when you pull out of Amazon, that's when it's going to cost. If you push, it's not going to cost. Keep that in mind, right? In terms of data storage, when you pull out of Amazon and when you keep the data within the Amazon itself, depending on the type of service that you're using, it's going to cost. But when you're pushing data into Amazon, like what I'm doing right now, they won't charge me for that. But if somebody else comes and pulls this data out of Amazon, then that's an out charge that is going to be registered to my account, right? So that is what you have to remember. So once that is done, you just hit upload, okay? There are some other options here. You can check it out with respect to server-side encryptions, digital signatures for verification of the integrity of your file. So you can do your checksums and stuff like that. Always give tag and metadata if you are working in a production environment, okay? So just click upload, and that's pretty straightforward. So it succeeded, nothing has failed. So now my folder essentially has this index.txt file, okay? So when you go here, when you click on the service itself, it's going to give you the URI of what that file object is. So essentially, this is where I was referring to, is that if you have, let's say, an index.html file, and you want that to be accessible by the public domain, so you just uncheck that permission policy, and then you just provide this as a URL for your website, right? And that will allow you to change this S3 bucket into a way to host your static website. Okay, so this is basically the object URL that you can provide it. And if you buy a domain name, like .com or .info or something like that from some service provider like Amazon or Google, and there are other stuff as well. So if you buy that, then you can map that custom domain to this object URL. So essentially, when that custom domain is pinged, it is translated to this DNS address, and then it kind of works from there, right? So you can get all the information that we talked about already, but what is important for us is to pay attention to this other two tabs that is available on the top of our, whatever you call this, the navigation bar, right? So the first one is basically the access control, which gives you an idea of who is able to do what kind of operation with respect to the files that is available, right? So only I have the option to kind of do a full permission, that is read and write both the files, right? I also have the ability to modify the access control list for the file itself, all right? And anything outside of that, they won't be able to kind of work with it. Then if you make changes to your file and stuff like that, and then you re-upload it and things like that, then essentially you can see those version IDs in these locations here, right? So that is what you have to keep in mind. So how do you set up for public access? So there are two options here. You can either uncheck that option, or you have the options to kind of work with it. So remember one thing that I told you, that if you delete the file and with version controlling being present, in the actual portal, you will see the file deleted, but you will have to come back to these versions to see that your file is actually present, right? So if you want to do a complete delete, you have to come to the version control tab, and then you have to select the file which you already deleted from your interface, and you need to delete it from this option here within version control. So you might want to make a note of this if you're ever going to be using with S3 and then version control being turned on. If you want to do a complete delete, you cannot just delete the file from the main interface. You have to come to the versions sub tab. You have to select the deleted file, which will still show up here. Okay. And then you have to delete all the different versions. So any changes that happens, this will keep on populating more and more different versions. So if you want to clean your bucket, essentially you have to come to versions, select everything, and then delete it, right? So please keep that in mind. And if you're using this as a log keeping purpose for like archival backup purposes, and you want to know what an employee did or what a developer did to a particular file, who did what in what instances, and you want to do an analysis on that, you go run some sort of software, then this is where you come. This is the location where you come to, and essentially you can download all those files and run whatever program that you are running here, right? So this is what you have to keep in mind. Okay. All right. So the other thing that you have to keep in mind, so that was just for the file, right? The options that we saw there was just for one individual file. Please keep that in mind. Okay. So if you come to the bucket itself, then you will see that there is another set of navigation menus at the top, which has these different options, right? So you can go to the properties and you can check what are the different options that you have associated with it. But the important one that we have here is basically this tab, which is the permissions tab, right? This is the fun part, essentially that you will be working with. Granted that you want to change the public access and stuff like that, right? So if you want to change the public access itself again, then you can go back to the edit menu, and then you can uncheck this button, and then you can kind of select from these sub menus if you want to give a specific access here. But if I try to save this at this point of time, then it will essentially tell me that you have complete access open that we have seen before. So we will have to confirm the fact that we are taking the responsibility that if something happens to our data, we are responsible for this. So please be very aware of this action. If you do this and your data gets compromised or something happens to your data, this is Amazon's way of telling you that you are knowingly doing this change, even though they have told you not to do it, right? So we confirm it. And then this is essentially enabled. So the next thing is, now if you disable, what if you want to create a policy of your own and you don't want to use any of these policies that is given here, right? So where we are going on with this discussion or with this exercise is that, okay, I have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, give or take, predefined policies with respect to access control, right? What if I don't want any of them? Okay. Oh my God, it will keep on making me confirm it. What if I don't want to use any of this, but I want to write my own policy for buckets, right? For my particular bucket. So if you want to write your own custom policy, you need to come to this field, which is bucket policy. And then you need to basically hit on edit. And this is where you can write your own policy. So I have a policy for you. That is there in the slides, that is created in the slides. And by the way, the language is JSON for all permissions policies, whether you're working with IAM service or whether you're here, it's all JSON, right? So you need to be very, I wouldn't say very good, but at least you need to understand how JSON works in order to work with it, right? So what I can do is I can add a new statement here. And I can start with the way that JSON is kind of given, which is to basically say, so this is, I'm writing this from slide 28 on the lecture PPT. So everybody, you can turn your attention there. So what I can do is first I need to specify my version. And in JSON, remember, just a quick note here is that both sides of the key and the value is essentially treated as a string. Right? In contrast to basic object notation, the JavaScript object notation requires us to essentially have both sides as string, right? So that is all you need to remember. So as long as you understand the mapping of key value pairs, what JSON brings into the picture is that it makes everything strings on both sides of the colon, right? So that's one way to quickly kind of work with it. So I'm going to pick up a policy that I copied from somewhere. I don't remember where I did it. at this point of time, but it was in some documentation file for S3, I think, because most of these demos are from there. So you start with a version, okay? And then you provide a statement, and that statement is going to specify what exactly are the permissions that will be associated with this particular bucket policy or with this particular bucket, right? So we need to specify statement, and the statement will consist of basically these third brackets where we will one by one specify what is going to happen within our policy itself, right? So there's a lot of nesting that is going on. So please be careful that you type it exactly as it is given in the slides itself. Otherwise, it will throw an error, a syntax error, and then you will have to spend a little bit of time trying to figure out how to debug those particular errors, right? So we basically have a curly braces, and then we have a serial ID, okay? And the serial ID is essentially what it is going to say is that you allow for public read in that particular thing, right? So allow public read, okay? So that's a single word that is there. And then we will move on to the next line, where we essentially have the next policy, which is what should I do with respect to my public policy is that I want to allow it. All right. And then after that, who will be allowed? So basically anything that is within the AWS platform, they will be allowed access to the policies itself. So how you express that is basically through this principal, okay? And then this principal has its own second brackets as well. And we close the second bracket. And what we want to write within the second bracket is basically who will be able to access this. So I'm basically allowing AWS to access it. And then I will give an star to signify everything, all the resources within AWS, okay? And then finally, not finally, I think we have two more here. So we will have the action that will be allowed. So the action that we are going to be allowing is with respect to reading the object within our S3 bucket. So we are going to write S3 colon get object, okay? And then the last effect that we have, or the last property that we are going to be specifying is our bucket itself. So essentially that is going to be signified by this resource tab. And now this is the last piece of information which will change for all of us because we will have to specify the URL of the bucket resource for which we are writing this policy. So all you need to kind of copy from the slides itself is basically the initial part, initial half of the domain itself. So the access is for AWS service, which is basically S3, and then it will have a bucket name. So here I will have to provide my bucket name, which I already have forgotten. I think it is there. Okay, so this is what we have to copy. So copy it from the top and then just paste it here. It's right above here. So the bucket ARN, the address resolution protocol, the address that is required for the resource, it is given here. So please don't copy everything from the slides as is. Make sure that you copy the right thing. Okay. So once this is done, then your second bracket closes, then your third bracket closes. And I think we need one more third bracket here, which will kind of wrap everything up, right? So the moment you put this, AWS does, I think it does a compilation. I'm not sure if it is an interpretation or not, but somebody has to double check me on that. But this is how you can write your own bucket policy if you are not too excited about the default policies that are available, right? And it is basically interpreting all of the different things that we have done in this policy here. Like it tells us that what are we allowing for, right? And who is included in those different options, right? So here, where I wrote the principal is going to be AWS, and I'm allowing all services that is present in AWS. So that is why you can get an action that here we have the entirety kit, the entire kit of AWS is basically available to us with respect to this, right? So that is the beauty, or that is the way where you can write your own policies here in the edit bucket policy. Or there were some examples. I think I took it from the example itself, but I still don't remember that, right? But if you do not have full expertise, which is quite normal as a beginner, we don't know everything, right? Even I don't know the full extent of all of the different properties that will be required here. So if you're ever in doubt, Amazon provides you with ample help. So you can go to this policy generator and it will walk you through this GUI, where it will ask you, what is it that you're trying to do, for which service or policy type that you're trying to do. You will do all of these things, and then you will just hit generate policy. And then you can take this policy back to where you were writing it and copy paste it, right? It also gives you some examples of different policies as well. I think I did it from here only. Yeah, I think I did it from here. So this gives you the option to kind of copy any of these examples that is there if it meets your requirements and stuff like that, right? So always remember, if you're stuck with respect to expressing something in code, the first place you should go looking for, if there is no support on the portal that you're working on itself, is go check the documentations. Most of the information is essentially there with respect to a demo, with respect to an example and stuff like that. And once you're done, you can essentially save the changes. I'm not going to apply these changes here, so I'm just going to hit cancel, but I hope everybody understands how exactly you can do it, right? All right, any questions at this point? I've been going on for a while. So once this is done, please make sure you delete it, okay? And you can see here, deleting the specific objects adds a delete marker to them. If you need to undo the delete action, you can delete the delete markers, blah, 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 and just confirm the delete. One thing to note here is when you're trying to delete a bucket, your data has to be cleaned up first. You cannot delete the bucket with data being present within the S3 bucket. So when you're trying to delete the S3 bucket, or when you're trying to delete a EBS volume or a file system, I think goes even with the data being there. But for S3, for sure, please delete the data first before you delete the bucket itself. Otherwise, it's not going to allow you to delete the bucket if you're trying to do so with data present in your bucket itself, right? So I'm just going to go ahead, delete it. Okay, so nothing has been failed to delete. Everything looks good here. So we'll come here. Okay, properties, permissions, metrics, management, and then access point. Okay, so nothing to do here. Everything looks good. So now I'll go back to my buckets. Okay, so there is this lone bucket that is there. I'll just go ahead and delete this. Okay, right. So can somebody tell me why it says the bucket is not empty? So let me show you.
Your index file into it. Your web index file.
Say that again. I didn't get you.
Didn't you upload the web index file?
I did, but I just deleted it right now.
Oh.
But
no.
You see, there is no objects, but it doesn't allow me to delete.
Well, that's interesting.
It does not treat it as empty. Right? We just talked about it like a few minutes ago. Does anybody remember? Well, I know you do. The one who responded in chat. Raise your hand if you know why this is happening. Any guesses? Think about it. We just discussed this, that it doesn't show on the main portal, but it is somewhere hidden. And there is a reason for why this is happening. So remember this bucket, when we created it, right, we enabled versioning for it, right? And we discussed about the fact that version control tracks addition, modification, deletion, right? So that means if I modified the file, it will show me both the versions of my modifications. If I delete the file, it will remove it from the actual UI portal, right? That is in front of us on the screen right now, but it is going to index that file, right? So that means it's going to track the changes that has happened to the file, and the change that has happened here is basically a deletion. So essentially, now if you open up the versioning, right? If I close the versioning, it says there is no objects because, well, that is what it is because I have deleted the object. But if I enable the versioning, it has kept a track of the fact that this file was deleted. So just like you do it in GitHub, not GitHub, but essentially using Git, right? You can track changes, you can, restore changes and those kind of things. You can deny changes and those kind of things, right? The same can happen here as well. So again, I will repeat this, that if you create an S3 bucket with versioning control enabled, right? Please be aware of the fact that when you delete a file and you do not have the show versioning UI enabled, you're going to see an empty bucket, but the bucket is not actually empty because the version control is keeping a track of the changes that has taken place. And deletion is only one of those changes where the original file is no longer there, but the version control still has an indexed file, which keeps it in a way like in a recycle bin or something like that, and doesn't delete it, right? So if you want to completely empty out this bucket, you need to delete that index itself before you can delete it. So now if I delete all of this information, it will give me that information that, you're going to lose it. And you can see here, the prompt changes from delete to permanently delete, right? So this is the perm delete this is for version enabled buckets. For just the deletion action, be careful about it because by default, the show version UI is not enabled. It is something that you have to enable by yourself, right? So now, if we go back to our bucket, if we select this, we should be able to delete it, right? Since we have already deleted itself. All right, so now you can see that this area is no longer grayed out. It is allowing me to delete it. And that's the reason why I did not do the edit and the addition. Because modification, it will still show you the main file, right? So to our normal eyes, we wouldn't realize that, oh, we will think the file is still there. The deletion is the only operation where the actual file goes away from the original UI, but it still keeps it indexed because of the version control, right? So that is something that you have to keep in mind, okay? So the takeaways for S3, first and foremost, it is deployed in a region. You can access it over the public URL if you set its permission in that particular way. There are 3 different features that is important for an S3, which is what type of storage class are you using? Is it standard or some sort of customized, specialized way, depending on the data that you're going to store? And the permission policies, that is how or what type of permission policies or where you can change the permission policies from. We also discussed about how to edit and write our own permission policy from scratch in JSON. By the way, that is the way where you specify the access control for most of the resources on AWS platform as well. That is not something that is specific to S3, but that's how you do it in S3 itself, right? And then we talked about the property of versioning or version control that is also available in S3, right? So as a self-exercise, if you want to test it out before you want to delete it, it's going to be a very simple exercise, but give it a try because that will also give you another way to keep in mind how to host static websites if you're ever in that situation. And it will be a little bit cheaper than your server, your EC2 option, because you're not running an instance, you won't be paying for that. You're only paying for how much capacity you're going to be using. And for a static website, it's not going to go much, depending on whether you use media files and stuff like that. It's up there. So what you can try as a self-exercise is to basically kind of, set up a static website, a portfolio website or something like that using the S3 service. So see that and see if you can access it on the public domain, okay? And I will leave the last exercise of this particular chapter for you as well. So remember, at the very beginning, I asked you to install the AWS CLI. since S3 is a public service, you can access it from any local computer, right? So you can access it over the public internet. You don't have to be present within the AWS infrastructure itself. So from slides 30 to 32, it's just 3 slides, give or take. Go through the exercise. The steps are already listed there. And the whole process is to basically generate an access ID. So in order to generate an access ID and stuff like that, you need to go to IAM. So remember, I will just tell you those one single step. And this will enable you to learn how to establish program access, or like if you're writing a program and you want to access something, then you can kind of work with that, right? So essentially, what you need to do is, depending on who the user is, who is going to programmatically access the different services on Amazon. In this particular case, the service that we are referring to is S3 itself. You need to essentially go to your users, and then you only have this one user that we are working with. So we go to that user, we select that user in, and then in this sub navigation tab that we have here, you need to go to security credentials, okay? And then you can see here that this is where you can create the access key. So any kind of API integration that you need to do for your resources, you need to go, I will list the steps again for you to remember, or you can always go back to the slides and check the steps if you forget it. You need to go to IAM service. You need to go to the user group, not the group, sorry, the user option in the left vertical menu, because each user has its own access key and stuff like that, right? And then you need to kind of navigate. You select that user, navigate to the security credentials sub tab, and then go down to where you see access keys. So any kind of program, you have to create this access key. In Google, they call it an API key. Here, you call it an access key. So essentially, if you're accessing from outside of the AWS platform, you basically need this person here to be able to do that, right? So please go through that exercise. That will also enable you to understand how to embed any type of AWS service, communication of any type of AWS service with a piece of code that you're writing, and that is going to be executing outside the AWS's infrastructure, right? And that will enable you to connect with it, okay? And version control we have already worked with, so you can kind of avoid the last step of that exercise, and you can kind of ignore that part. But you just have to make sure that you are able to use this access key, and you can connect to the AWS platform using the AWS CLI that is running on your local computers, by the way. Okay, not on an EC2 instance, because EC2 instance is already there. So, we have already discussed about all those things, right? So you need to work from your client terminal itself. So that is going to be a fun exercise. So any questions about that? Any doubts, any questions till this point? We can delete the user altogether. No questions? Okay. All right, so moving on, I think we will just introduce the next chapter, which is basically this guy. Okay, the relational, or not the relational is basically the first topic. What we need, and make sure you delete your buckets once you're done with it, okay? By the way, I have to keep on reminding this. So don't forget about that. All right, so databases that we are going to be working with, right? So there are two different deployments of the database. The deployment of the database in itself is always going to happen within the subnet, where the instances are going to connect with the database itself, right? But there is also a fault-tolerant based database architecture that we are going to, or we can deploy, which will be enabled by snapshots again. So snapshots again come into the picture when you're working with databases as well. So that deployment, which is the more fault-tolerant way of deploying a database, is that if your primary server fails, the service can switch back to your replica itself. So that is known as a multi-AZ deployment, right? So that is one of the ways in which we are going to do. So over the course of our discussion in databases, we are going to talk about two different categories of database that is offered as a service from Amazon. The first one is known as the RDS service, And then there is another one, which is known as the, I think, DynamoDB. Okay, so this is the NoSQL database service that is offered by Amazon. Okay, so we are going to talk about these two databases service. And in the relational database service, we are going to look into the architectural deployment of two different services. One is the normal or the regular database architecture, which doesn't have a backup or which doesn't have a secondary server that is just monitoring what is happening. It is called the read replica, right? And then we are going to create this multi-AZ deployment architecture, and that is going to cost us some money because free tier account does not support multi-AZ deployment. So we're going to spend a few bucks, probably $2 or $3 or so, okay, in order to kind of understand the structure of that fault-tolerant database deployment. All right. So database engine for Amazon. So those are the two things, and then the different things that we are going to discuss. I'm not going to talk about how databases work. This is not a database course. So the assumption is that you have some idea about databases, you know how to work with relational databases, and then you have some understanding of how to work with NoSQL databases. You know how to do queries and stuff like that. So I'm not going to go into any of the database related stuff itself. I'm going to focus on the networking and the architecture of how you are going to deploy your databases. And in one exercise, we will connect, or I will show you how to connect the databases with your EC2 instances and probably host a WordPress server on the EC2 instances that is supported by a relational database. So I will show you the full stack or the different types of applications that you can do with your database, but from a networking perspective and not from a database perspective, because that's a different course altogether, right? So before we wrap up today's class, just to quickly note the fact that these are just some of the few examples of different clients of Amazon, which uses the RDS engine, right? The relational database engine, right? So it offers, I think it has increased its offering, but I'm not exactly sure, but we have like 6 different offerings of relational databases from AWS, right? Amazon's own version is known as Amazon Aurora, okay? Then you have your MySQL from Oracle. If you're familiar with MariaDB, then you also get to use MariaDB. You can use PostgreSQL, Microsoft SQL Server, and then Oracle's version is also there, Oracle DB2 or IBM DB2, I think. But Oracle, this is a little bit different, okay? So all of these are different options of relational database that is available. NoSQL is DynamoDB itself, that is file-based, so that's a different beast altogether. So we're not going to discuss that right away. But these are some of the companies that uses the RDS services there, right? So Blackboard is basically an alternative to Moodle and Canvas, I believe. We have General Electric, Netflix is there, Expedia, I believe most of you have heard of. Have you heard of Intuit? Have you heard of this company?
Yeah.
Right? So it is also like I wouldn't say the Facebook, but it has now consolidated many different services under a single roof with respect to financial services, right? So if you have heard about tax filing software such as TurboTax, if you have heard about financial apps, which kind of shows you your credit report and stuff like that, which is known as Credit Karma. So right now, this is the parent company, right? So this is kind of consolidated everything, right? So all of these are the different customers. You can check the case studies. This is something interesting that Amazon has included for some of the services, some of the bigger services. So going forward, right now, I have kind of included all of these different case studies. So you can read up on that, and it's a good read. It's a quick read, and it's a good read as to like how or what type of services they are using or how their architecture looks like and stuff like, not exactly all of the architecture, but it gives you a good understanding of how it is done, okay? So one of the important things for you to know is that we are looking into a DB server. So the reason why the DB server is going to be deployed to a subnet itself, because the DB server needs some sort of compute engine to run, right? So that means it will have its own dedicated instance. So if you read between the lines, what we have to remember is that if you're launching a database service, in a way, you're actually launching an EC2 instance. But we don't say Elastic Compute Cloud because it's not an infrastructure that is being allocated to you as a service, right? The database server is being allocated to you as a service, right? So you don't have the access to internally what is the environment within which the database is being launched, although you do have some freedom or some flexibility to choose what type of compute engine is going to support your database server. So what I mean by that is that if you want to choose, let's say we are working on T2 micro in the free tier account, right? That gives us one virtual CPU core and stuff like that. So if you want to increase that, right? And if you want to increase, let's say from 1 GB of RAM to probably 8 GB of RAM to have something more reasonably practical, right? For modern day services, then you do have the option to kind of change those instance type, which will be supporting the database server, right? So you can also choose instance types which are memory optimized. You can choose instance types which are storage optimized. You have that freedom, right? But internally, what is going on, you don't control all of those operations as you can do in a completely available infrastructure as a service offering, right? So what we are going to do in the next class is we are going to talk, or we're going to start with exercise 1, which is to launch our RDS instances. And then the second exercise that we are going to be doing is to kind of modify our initial deployment into a more fault-tolerant deployment, which we call as a multi-availability zone deployment for database services. All right. And then we are going to create the read replica is basically an extension of this multi-AZ deployment, because without this read replica, you don't have a backup server, so to speak. And one of the exercises that we are going to do towards the end is to kind of connect this RDS or our database server with an EC2 server and transform this EC2 server. Instead of creating our own website this time, static website, what we are going to do is we are going to install the WordPress stack on top of that EC2 instance, okay, using PHP. We are going to run that, right? So we will have a WordPress template. If some of you are familiar with WordPress-based web application development, then you should be familiar with what I'm talking about. If not, you can check it out. What is WordPress? It will give you some idea before we start doing this in the next class itself, right? So we're going to quickly browse through these different options. And then the next one that we will move on to is basically the DynamoDB, which is the non-relational database of AWS itself, right? So we will wrap up here for today, and I will take any questions that you may have, and then I will see you all online again on Monday. Okay, thank you.